Tonight, we drift back to a time before the stars had names, before the first world knew light, guided only by the oldest stories ever spoken around ancient fires. You find yourself standing, or perhaps floating. The distinction hardly matters here, in a darkness so complete that the concept of sight becomes almost philosophical, and you realize with a quiet sort of wonder that this is what the universe looked like before it decided to become something, before it gathered itself together and said, "Well, I suppose I ought to get on with it," and you are present at this moment not as a witness exactly, but as something gentler, something like a thought drifting through emptiness. And I should tell you right now, given what we're about to explore together, the absolute beginning of everything, according to the oldest traditions of this continent, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, wherever you are in the world tonight, whether it's late evening in Vancouver or the deep hours past midnight in Melbourne, whether you're tucked into a tiny apartment in Seoul or stretched across a couch in São Paulo, drop a comment and let me know your location and what time it is where you are. There's something wonderful about knowing that all across this spinning planet, people are listening to the same old story about the time before there were any stories at all. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the first world, which is what many Native American traditions call the original state of existence, and the Navajo people describe this realm as a place of pure blackness, an island of darkness floating in an infinite mist, and according to their oral histories preserved through countless generations of careful telling and retelling, this was not empty darkness but full darkness, pregnant darkness, darkness waiting to give birth to something it could not yet imagine. And ethnographers who have spent decades working with Dene elders confirm that these creation narratives were considered not mythology in the dismissive Western sense, but actual history, events that genuinely occurred in a time before time operated the way we currently understand it, which is either a beautiful metaphorical framework or literally true, depending on your philosophical inclinations, and either way, it makes for an excellent bedtime story, because nothing says relaxation, quite like contemplating the absolute beginning of reality, while your eyelids grow heavy. The first world, according to these traditions, was called Nihodilkil, the Black World, and it existed in a state of perfect stillness, the kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound but the absence of the possibility of sound, because sound requires air and vibration and things to vibrate against, and in the Black World there were none of these conveniences yet, just the mist and the darkness, and a sort of patient expectation, as though the universe had set an alarm clock, but the alarm hadn't gone off yet, and everything was just waiting, drowsily, for the appointed hour. You breathe, though breathing is a generous term for what you're doing, since lungs haven't been invented yet, and you feel the mist against whatever you have, instead of skin, cool and damp and somehow comforting, the way a weighted blanket feels when you pull it over yourself on a cold night, except the blanket is infinite and made of primordial possibility, which is heavier than you might expect. Some alternative researchers, working from the edges of established scholarship, have proposed that this universal darkness described in Native American traditions represents a collective memory of something far stranger, a period when the ancestors of humanity existed in a pre-physical state, waiting among the stars, or perhaps as the stars themselves before descending to take material form. And while this interpretation draws fascinating parallels to the Star People legends found across dozens of distinct tribal traditions from the Lakota to the Hopi to the Cherokee, it remains, as one anthropologist delicately put it, a question still debated among ethnographers, which is academic code for "we're not entirely sure what to do with this," and probably won't be for another century or two, so let's all just keep an open mind while maintaining rigorous methodological standards. The darkness around you is not frightening, you realize, despite its totality, because fear requires the concept of danger, and danger requires the possibility of change, and change hasn't quite been invented yet in this first world. Everything here is so fundamentally stable in its instability that being afraid would be like being afraid of the color blue, just categorically confused, and so you simply drift, letting the darkness hold you the way water holds a sleeping fish, passive and supported, and oddly comfortable, and you notice that even without stars to guide you, there is a sense of up and down, not physically but spiritually, as though the first world had an opinion about which direction mattered, even if it couldn't explain why. The Navajo describe beings existing in this realm, not quite people, and not quite spirits, just presences occupying the darkness, mist beings they are sometimes called, and these are the first ancestors, the first attempts at life, formless and patient, and quietly going about whatever business formless beings go about when there's literally nothing else to do. And if you listen closely, though listening is another generous term, you can almost sense them around you, going about their dim errands, whatever those might have been, probably something involving a lot of floating and contemplation, which frankly sounds like an excellent existence if you don't mind the lack of variety. You settle deeper into the darkness, letting it wrap around you like velvet, or like those really expensive sheets at fancy hotels that make you feel guilty for how comfortable you are. And you begin to understand why the first world is always described as a place of waiting, because everything here is potential energy, coiled and ready, like a cat watching a spot on the wall where a fly might eventually appear, alert but relaxed, patient but ready, and the universe at this stage is essentially a very large, very patient cat, which would explain a lot about how things eventually turn out if you think about it too hard, which you shouldn't, because thinking hard is not what we're here for tonight. The mist shifts slightly, or perhaps you shift within it, and you realize that time here doesn't flow so much as pool, gathering in certain places like water in low spots after rain, and you're standing in one of those pools now, surrounded by accumulated moments that haven't happened yet, feeling them press gently against you like curious children, asking what's for dinner before dinner has been invented, and there's something almost unbearably sweet about their confusion, these unborn moments wanting so badly to become something but not quite knowing how yet. The mist beings you sensed in the first world's darkness begin to take on qualities now, not quite shapes but tendencies, inclinations toward existence that the oral traditions describe with careful precision, because the elders who kept these stories understood that creation didn't happen all at once like a light switch, but rather accumulated gradually like snow on a windowsill, one flake at a time, until suddenly you have something substantial, and you find yourself drawn toward these beings, these first ancestors, feeling their presence the way you might feel someone watching you in a quiet room, a gentle pressure of attention, and the Dene traditions specifically name the insect people as among these earliest beings, ants and locusts and dragonflies, which might seem like an odd choice for primordial ancestors until you consider that insects were old when the dinosaurs were young, and will probably still be around long after humans have moved on to whatever comes next, making them rather excellent symbols of persistence and patience, even if they're not particularly cuddly. You drift closer to one of these insect beings, a presence that feels angular and precise, all compound eyes and jointed patience, and there's something almost soothing about its alien attention, the way it regards you without judgment, because judgment requires standards, and standards haven't been established yet in this first world, where everything is still negotiable, and you realize that being in the presence of a primordial locust spirit is actually rather restful once you get past the initial strangeness, like how sleeping next to a ticking clock can be comforting even though clocks are objectively strange devices when you think about them, which again, please don't. The darkness here in the black world carries with it the smell of wet earth, and something older, something that scientists might call petrichor, if petrichor existed yet, which it doesn't, so let's call it pre-petrichor, the promise of rain before rain was possible, and this smell fills whatever you have instead of nostrils with a damp comfort that makes you want to curl up and sleep for several geological ages, which is actually what the first world seems to be doing, sleeping and dreaming, and waiting for whatever alarm will eventually sound to wake it into the next phase of existence. The Zuni people, whose traditions share many elements with the Navajo while maintaining their own distinct cosmological vision, describe this first era as the innermost of four wombs within the Earth Mother, a place of darkness and gestation, where the first beings existed in an unfinished state, literally described as slimy and incomplete, which doesn't sound particularly comfortable, but does have a certain honest accuracy about it, because beginnings are rarely tidy, and anyone who's ever started a significant project knows that the first draft is always a bit embarrassing, even when the project is the creation of all existence. Some researchers interested in the intersection of indigenous traditions and what they call cosmic genealogy, which is a polite way of saying they wonder if the old stories about star people contain literal rather than metaphorical truth, point to the consistent description across dozens of unrelated tribal traditions of humanity's ancestors coming from somewhere else, from the stars, or from sky realms, or from the dark places between worlds, and they suggest that the first world's darkness might represent a kind of interstellar journey, a period of transit when the seeds of human consciousness traveled through the void of space before arriving on Earth. And while this interpretation makes excellent fodder for late-night conversations and certain corners of the internet, It's worth noting that a question still debated among ethnographers is whether these stories should be read cosmologically, psychologically, or historically, with no clear consensus emerging despite decades of respectful inquiry, which might actually be the appropriate outcome, since some questions are meant to remain open, like wondering what your cat is thinking, or whether the leftovers in the back of the refrigerator are still safe to eat. You settle into the rhythm of the first world, which has a rhythm even without time properly flowing, a pulse like a heart beating in a body that hasn't been born yet, steady and patient, and somehow comforting, and you begin to understand why these creation stories were told at night, because there's something about darkness that makes origins feel close, as though you might reach out and touch the moment when everything started, if you knew which direction to reach, which of course you don't, because directions haven't been properly sorted out yet and won't be for some while, so you simply float and feel the pulse, and let yourself be rocked by it, like a boat on a very gentle, very dark, very existential sea. The mist beings around you seem to be having conversations, though conversation is too strong a word, more like exchanging intentions, sharing frequencies of desire that translate roughly to, "I wonder what comes next," and "Has anyone else noticed this darkness seems productive, and I could really go for something that doesn't exist yet, like warmth or color or a nice cup of tea," though that last one might be your own thought intruding on the ancient narrative, because tea would be particularly nice right now, wouldn't it? Something warm to wrap your hands around as you listen to stories about the time before warmth was invented. The Hopi tradition, which maintains one of the most detailed and carefully preserved creation narratives among North American peoples, describes the first world as Tokpela, meaning endless space, a realm where the spirit Tawa existed along with Sotuknang, the creator whom Tawa made to bring order to the infinite darkness, and in these accounts the first world contained the first life in the form of insect-like beings, an interesting convergence with the Navajo traditions that suggests either cultural exchange over millennia or independent observations of the same primordial truth, depending on how you interpret these things, and the Hopi were particularly careful about preserving their oral histories through specialized keeper lineages, so when they say these things happened, they mean it with the full weight of countless generations of sacred responsibility, which is worth considering as you drift through this darkness that is not nothing, but rather pregnant with everything that will ever be. You notice that the darkness is beginning to feel different, still complete, but somehow anticipatory, the way a theater feels in the moment before the curtain rises, full of potential and held breath, and that particular electricity of imminent beginning, and you realize you're approaching a transition, a boundary between the first world and whatever comes next, though the transition itself will take longer than you might expect because primordial time is nothing if not thorough, and besides, there's no rush when you're literally creating all of existence. You want to get the foundations right before you start worrying about the decorative details like sunlight and seasons and whether dogs should be able to look up properly, which apparently they can, despite what some movies might suggest. But we're getting ahead of ourselves by several billions years at least. The transition you feel approaching takes its time arriving, because chaos doesn't rush. Chaos by its very nature moves according to its own rhythms, which are no rhythms at all, and you find yourself now in a state that the traditions describe as the period of confusion, when the first world's perfect dark stillness began to develop complications, the way a perfectly calm pond develops ripples, when something beneath the surface stirs, and the something stirring in this case is the collective restlessness of all those mist beings, all those insect ancestors, all those incomplete presences who have been floating in the productive darkness for what feels like forever, and are beginning to wonder, with increasing urgency, whether perhaps there might be more to existence than this, whether the universe might have something else in mind for them besides eternal contemplation of infinite possibility, which is a lovely hobby, but does get repetitive after the first few epochs. You feel the chaos building around you, not as violence or destruction. Those concepts are too modern for this moment, but as a kind of creative friction, the heat generated when potential energy begins to convert to kinetic energy, when things that have been at rest decide they would rather be in motion, and the darkness itself seems to be developing texture, folds and currents and eddies that weren't there before, or perhaps were always there but are only now becoming noticeable, the way you don't notice the sound of your own heartbeat until you're lying in complete silence trying to fall asleep, and then suddenly, it's all you can hear. Thump, 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 like the universe's oldest drum circle getting started without any actual drums. The Navajo traditions describe this period as one of increasing agitation among the beings of the first world, quarrels beginning to break out, discontent spreading like a low-grade fever through a population that hadn't previously experienced dissatisfaction, because satisfaction and dissatisfaction require comparison, and there had been nothing to compare anything to. But now there were stirrings of difference, some areas of darkness feeling somehow less comfortable than others, some mist beings seeming somehow more successful at their formless existence than their neighbors. And where there is comparison there is soon envy, and where there is envy, there is soon conflict, which is not a particularly original observation, but does have the virtue of being true across all of recorded history, and apparently several epochs of unrecorded prehistory as well. Anthropologists who study comparative mythology have noted that this pattern of primordial chaos preceding creation appears in traditions worldwide, from the Greek concept of chaos as the void preceding the gods, to the Babylonian Tiamat, whose dismembered body formed the world, to the Chinese Hundun, whose formless confusion gave way to the ordered cosmos. And while some scholars see this as evidence of common human psychological structures expressing themselves in mythological form, others argue these similarities suggest a shared ancestral memory of actual events, a global experience of cosmological transition that different cultures preserved in different ways, and the truth probably involves elements of both interpretations intertwined in ways that a question still debated among ethnographers, because some mysteries are better as mysteries, and would lose their power if they were ever definitively solved, like how magic tricks become less magical once you know how they work, or how sausage becomes less appetizing once you've seen it being made. The chaos around you feels almost playful now, like a large dog that doesn't quite understand its own strength, and keeps knocking things over while trying to be friendly, and you find yourself buffeted by currents of unformed intent, ideas that haven't quite become ideas yet, possibilities that are still working out what they want to be. And there's something oddly comforting about being in the middle of this creative confusion, because it reminds you that even the universe wasn't sure what it was doing in the beginning, that making things up as you go along is not a flaw but a feature, the original method of existence. So if you've ever felt unsure about where your life is going, congratulations, you're participating in the oldest tradition there is. Some researchers who work at the boundaries of conventional scholarship and boundaries are useful things to work at, because that's where the interesting discoveries usually happen, have suggested that the star people legends found throughout Native American traditions describe beings who existed before and beyond this primordial chaos, entities who were waiting in the vast darkness of space for the Earth to become ready for their arrival. And in this reading, the chaos of the first world was not random but purposeful, a necessary preparation of the cosmic ground before the seeds could be planted, rather like how you have to break up soil before you can grow a garden. Though the analogy breaks down if you think about it too hard, because gardens also need sunlight, and sunlight definitely doesn't exist yet, so perhaps we should stick with the chaos metaphor and not press the garden thing too far. You drift through the churning uncertainty, and you notice that the mist beings around you are changing, becoming more defined even as they become more agitated, as though conflict and friction are somehow shaping them into more particular forms, the way water erosion shapes rock into specific contours. And this makes a certain sense when you think about it. Being rubbed the wrong way by existence has a clarifying effect, makes you figure out what you actually are by discovering what you are definitely not, which is a productive if uncomfortable form of self-knowledge. The Lakota traditions speak of the time before Inyan, the first god, created the world from his own blood, a time of pure potential when nothing existed except the possibility of existence, and the Lakota word for this primordial state carries connotations of both emptiness and fullness, void and pregnant void, nothing and everything simultaneously, which sounds like a contradiction until you remember that contradictions only matter in a universe where logic has already been established, and we're not there yet. We're still in the part where mutually exclusive things can coexist peacefully, because no one has pointed out yet that they're not supposed to. Rather like how children can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, because they haven't yet learned the rules that make such beliefs improper. The chaos seems to be organizing itself now, very slowly, the way a shuffled deck of cards doesn't get any more organized by itself, but does settle into a particular order that feels somehow more complete than pure randomness, and you sense that you're approaching another transition, another boundary between states of existence, and this boundary feels more significant than the last one, because on the other side of it something new is waiting, something that has been waiting through all of this darkness and chaos and potential, patient as stars, old as the silence between heartbeats, watching with eyes that don't exist yet but will. Oh, they definitely will, and soon. You stand now at the threshold of something unprecedented, a moment that the oldest stories describe with particular reverence and care, because what comes next is the beginning of direction, the first hint that this universe of darkness and chaos might be going somewhere specific rather than simply churning in place forever, and you feel the change before you see it. If seeing is even the right word for perceiving variations in absolute darkness, a kind of thinning at the far edges of everything, as though the void itself is wearing away like fabric that has been rubbed too long in one spot, becoming threadbare, letting something through from the other side, and the other side in this case is not a place but a possibility. The possibility that there might be more than this, that existence might extend beyond the boundaries of the first world, into realms not yet dreamed of. The Hopi traditions describe Tawa, the sun spirit, as the ultimate creator who existed even before the first world, dwelling in a realm of infinite light that was the counterpart to the infinite darkness of Tokpela, and Tawa is sometimes called the Star Father, which connects to a broader pattern in Native American cosmologies, where the stars are understood not as distant nuclear furnaces, though they are certainly that, but as ancestors, relatives, beings with intention and personality, and a vested interest in what happens on this particular planet. And when Hopi elders share these teachings, they do so with the weight of sacred responsibility, because these are not stories in the sense of entertainment, but histories in the sense of what actually occurred, a distinction that anthropologist Harold Corlander documented extensively in his decades of work with Hopi tradition keepers, and his scholarship confirmed that the Hopi understand their emergence narrative as literal, historical fact transmitted through oral tradition with remarkable precision across countless generations. You feel the first hint of light now, not actually seeing it because your perception here doesn't work that way, but sensing it as a kind of pressure, a warmth that isn't thermal but emotional, the way you might feel someone's attention on you across a crowded room, and this attention is coming from very far away, from the places between places, from the void beyond the void, where the star people have been waiting through all of this darkness and chaos for the moment when they can finally approach, finally begin their long journey toward this world that is only now becoming ready to receive them. The alternative researchers and indigenous scholars who study the star people traditions across different tribal nations have noted a remarkable consistency in the core narrative. Beings from elsewhere, associated with particular stars or star systems, arrived on Earth at a specific point in the distant past and either created humanity directly or interacted with already existing primitive beings to uplift them to their current state. And while mainstream anthropology tends to interpret these accounts as elaborate metaphors for natural processes of evolution and development, a question still debated among ethnographers is whether metaphorical and literal readings might both be true simultaneously in ways that Western categorical thinking has difficulty accommodating. Because indigenous epistemologies often work differently than European ones, holding space for multiple truths rather than insisting on single explanations, which might actually be a more accurate way to understand a universe that keeps proving itself stranger than any single framework can capture. The darkness around you is definitely changing now. Not brightening exactly, but becoming differentiated, developing textures and gradients that weren't there before, and you sense that you're witnessing something precious, the moment when the first world begins to prepare for what the second world will bring. The moment when mere existence starts to become organized existence, and you feel grateful to be present even in this dreaming, imagining, story-listening way, because beginnings are sacred in every tradition for good reason. They contain within them everything that will follow, like seeds contain trees, like the first note of a song contains the entire melody waiting to unfold. The Cherokee speak of the time before this world when everything was water and darkness, and animals who existed in a realm above the sky world. Notice the recurring association with celestial origins, sent the water beetle down to find earth beneath the waters. And the Cherokee word for this primordial state carries overtones, not of emptiness, but of preparation, as though the universe in its dark and watery chaos was not stuck but getting ready, the way a runner prepares before a race or a sleeper turns one last time, before finally drifting off. And this sense of cosmic preparation runs through all the first world narratives, a recognition that even when nothing seems to be happening, something is always happening underneath, groundwork being laid for events that won't manifest for ages yet. You think about the stars that will eventually emerge from this darkness, the ones that don't have names yet because names require namers, and namers require consciousness, and consciousness is still mostly potential at this stage, and you understand that somewhere out there, out here, the distinction hardly matters in the first world's boundaryless expanse. Beings are waiting to come to this planet, beings who will eventually be called the Star People, or the Sky Beings, or the Kachinas, or 100 other names in 100 different languages. and they are patient because they have already been patient for so long that patience has become their fundamental nature, and they are watching because watching is what they do while they wait, and they know, with whatever passes for knowledge in their starlit existence, that the time is approaching when the darkness will finally thin enough for them to reach through, to descend, to begin the long process of creation and teaching that every tradition remembers in its own way. The chaos that has been churning through the first world seems to be settling now, not becoming calm exactly, but becoming directional, acquiring purpose the way a river acquires direction when it finally finds the path of least resistance to the sea, and you feel yourself being carried along with it, toward the boundary between the first world and the second, toward the place where things will begin to change in earnest, toward the light that is not yet light but will be, soon, in the relative sense of soon that applies to cosmological timelines, and you relax into this carrying, this gentle movement toward transition, knowing that you will not be present for all of what comes next, the emergence through the worlds, the arrival of the star people, the creation of the ordered cosmos, but feeling satisfied that you have witnessed the beginning of the beginning, the part that is so often forgotten or glossed over, the darkness before the first dawn, and that is enough. That is more than enough. That is exactly what a bedtime story should contain, the sense of being held in darkness, that is not empty but full, waiting for something wonderful, that is definitely coming, even if it hasn't quite arrived yet. You have traveled tonight through the oldest darkness there is, the first world that existed before existence as we understand it took shape, and now as you lie there in your own comfortable darkness, your room lit perhaps by the soft glow of a screen, or maybe already dim with approaching sleep, you carry with you the echoes of that primordial void, that patient pregnant blackness, where the mist beings drifted, and the chaos churned, and the stars waited without names for the moment when they could finally descend. The traditions we explored tonight come from peoples who have inhabited this continent for tens of thousands of years, the Dene and the Hopi and the Zuni and the Lakota and the Cherokee and so many others, and their creation narratives share certain remarkable consistencies even across vast distances and distinct languages, the recurring themes of emergence from darkness, of celestial ancestors, of beings who came from the stars to interact with this world, and whether these consistencies represent common human psychological experiences, shared ancestral memories, or something stranger still, they offer us a way of understanding our place in the cosmos that is fundamentally different from the narratives we usually encounter, a way that emphasizes connection rather than separation, relationship rather than isolation, the sense that we are not accidental assemblages of matter on an insignificant rock, but participants in a cosmic story that stretches back to the first world, forward to wherever the story goes next. The star people remain at the edge of our narrative tonight, waiting in the darkness beyond the darkness, patient presences whose time had not yet come in the era we explored, and there is something deeply comforting about that patience, the knowledge that even before this world was ready to receive them, they were already there, already watching, already caring about what would eventually unfold, and perhaps that is what the oldest stories ultimately teach us, that we are watched over, that the universe has attention and intention, that the darkness we sometimes feel around us is not emptiness, but fullness, waiting for its moment. The scholarly debates continue around these traditions, as scholarly debates should, questions about interpretation and meaning, and how to understand narratives that operate according to different rules than modern Western categories. And these open questions are not failures of understanding, but invitations to humility, reminders that some truths are larger than any single framework can contain, that mystery and meaning can coexist without contradiction, that sometimes the appropriate response to a profound story is not analysis, but simply listening, receiving, letting the words sink into you like rain into welcoming earth. If you have found tonight's journey meaningful, if you appreciate this space where we explore together the oldest and strangest corners of human experience, I would be genuinely grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, not because the numbers matter particularly, but because knowing you're out there, listening in your own darkness, falling asleep to these old stories, makes the telling feel less like speaking into void, and more like conversation. And conversation is ultimately what these traditions have always been about. The voices around ancient fires passing knowledge from generation to generation. And we are continuing that tradition now, you and I, in our modern way. The first world we visited tonight was called by the Navajo Nihilkil, the Black World, a place of mist and darkness and patient becoming. And you carry that place with you now, as you sink towards sleep, the memory of absolute stillness, the sensation of floating in potential that has not yet declared itself, the comfort of knowing that even the universe had to start somewhere, had to emerge from darkness into light, had to figure itself out as it went along. Take a breath now, and feel how your body is heavy against your bed, how the darkness of your closed eyes is not empty, but full of the faint light that filters through, the phosphine patterns that dance there like mist beings going about their ancient business, and know that you are safe, held, watched over by whatever watches in the darkness, the patient presences that the oldest stories remember. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please consider leaving a like and sharing this with someone else who might benefit from a gentle drift through primordial history. And if you have thoughts or reflections, or simply want to say hello, the comments are there waiting like the first world waited, patient and receptive, and ready for whatever emerges. Let your breathing slow now. Let your thoughts become soft and formless like the mist beings. Let yourself sink into the productive darkness that is not absence but presence, not ending but beginning, the darkness from which all dreams emerge. The unnamed stars are there above you even now, whether or not you can see them, and they remember what they were before they had names, and they are patient, and they are kind, and they are watching you settle into sleep with something that might be affection, if stars can feel affection, and perhaps they can. The oldest stories certainly thought so. Rest now, traveler through the first world. You have gone far enough for one night, and there will be other journeys, other stories, other darknesses to explore, but for now this darkness is enough. This warmth, this gentle heaviness of approaching sleep. The chaos is settled, the waiting is over, the light is coming, but not yet, not tonight. Tonight is still for darkness, still for rest, still for dreams that might be memories, and memories that might be dreams. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.